Vampires. Hot vampires. If there is one creature in horror of which we can't seem to get enough, it is vampires. Did you know that Dracula is the single most represented literary character in cinema, with something like 538 movies as of 2015? When it comes to monsters, their media representation is probably only surpassed by zombies, which, let's be real, are boring. They're dumb, ugly, and smelly. If you're a zombie kind of person, you should
take a leak.
Don't even get me started on werewolves. If you're a werewolf kind of person, well, good job on learning how to use a computer, I guess. Anyway, vampires. There's just something special about them, isn't there? Among classic monsters, they're arguably the most relatable and human-looking. Add to that their eternal life and youth, sprinkle in some inherent attractiveness, be it magical or physical. And don't forget to top it off with a tragic moral conundrum which makes them all
complicated, dark, and mysterious. To suck or not to suck? That is the question.
It's the perfect recipe for a creature which anyone can love if done right. But it's not that simple. The main thing that makes vampires so interesting and complex is how fluid and ever-changing their portrayal is through time. Just think about a few basic vampire facts, for example. Does sunlight kill them?
Yes.
Does the cross stop them?
No.
Does garlic?
Probably not.
Do they have to sleep in a coffin?
Not anymore.
Can they turn into other creatures like bats and wolves?
No.
Do you become a vampire if one bites you?
Have babies.
Can they cross running water? Has anyone actually ever cared about this one? Most importantly, are they evil monsters to be banished or cursed individuals who deserve some empathy? Well, you see, it's kinda complicated. They did start out as horrible monsters, but they've evolved through time, reflecting different cultural tendencies in Western society. They became increasingly complex and are seen more as a neutral figure today, anti-heroes or even as the good guys. How did all of this happen? Let's explore their history and the way they were portrayed in the early days of cinema, to then focus on some contemporary representations in films, cartoons, and video games. So, let's start from the roots. Where did vampires originate? Everywhere, really. You see, pretty much every culture has their own version of these guys. The one that interests us, though, stems from the folklore of this area, somewhere over here. Official reports of vampires or revenants started to crop up in Eastern Europe. They were usually believed to be recently deceased people that came out of their coffins at night to suck the blood of the living, especially of their family members. Actual doctors, surgeons, and policemen wrote of their first-hand experiences with them, not just lunatics or town drunkards. So, could there be some truth to this whole thing? Well, this is where it gets funny, although admittedly macabre. Most reports never actually mention seeing the supposed vampires in action, just the aftermath. For example, the family member of a recently deceased guy would be found dead, and when the townspeople would go to check his grave, they'd find him all inflated with dark skin and blood coming out of his mouth. Either that, or they'd find him still intact and not decomposed at all, allegedly. You see, the problem is that in the 18th and 19th century, people didn't really have a good grasp on human decomposition. They didn't know how long a body can take to decompose if it's buried deep enough in cold climate, or how it can naturally inflate with gases and liquids because of the decomposition process itself. Add to this the fact that we usually find vampires in cultures where bodies are buried and not cremated, the fact that vampirism was only present in the lower classes and not in the upper ones, where people had the means to properly bury their dead, or the fact that vampirism spread especially during times of war and during epidemics, when the number of deaths was greatest and the use of shallow graves was commonplace. This is probably also where stories of vampires turning into wolves come from. Animals are pretty good at sniffing out corpses if they're not very, very deep. And it also explains why vampires were thought to attack their family members. You know, the people who were the most at risk of contagion from the guy who probably just died from some kind of pestilence. And it was thought that vampires smelled foul, like a dead body. So, now that we know all of this, let's run down the list of the classic vampire rules and weaknesses again. Why do they sleep in a coffin? Because that's where they were actually the whole time, because they were dead. Why do they only come out at night and avoid sunlight? Because they never actually went anywhere and nobody dared to check the graves at night. Why do they feed on blood? They would just be found decomposing with fluids coming out of their mouths and were thought to be gorged on the blood of the living. Why the garlic? For the same reason that plague doctor masks had herbs and aromatic items in their beaks, probably. Why the cross? Christians. Why did they turn into wolves? They didn't. Wolves and dogs would just dig out the shallow graves. Why did they turn into bats? Well, there is actually a vampire bat whose diet consists of blood, so... Why the stake in the heart? Decomposing body, inflated with gases and fluids, sharp object, yeah. Why couldn't they cross running water? Geographic reasons or something. Again, who cares about this one? The funniest and most disturbing occurrence, though, is when the dead person would actually allegedly sit up in their coffin and the people would banish the undead by throwing stuff at it, putting it down once and for all. Yeah, that person was probably still alive before you clobbered it to death. So, now we know where the Drinky Boys come from, and we know they were just a superstition and not at all real because they couldn't possibly exist, obviously. But wait, you might think, a smelly and bloated corpse doesn't sound like the vampires I know, and you'd be right, something changed along the way. How did we get to where we are now, with all of these hot and gloomy emo vampires? So, obviously, for the Count himself, we have to start with Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, a very Catholic book in which everyone needs to monologue about God and righteousness before doing anything. So it all takes like a billion years to go from point A to point B. But what's the big bad himself like in the OG? Well, for one, he pretty much just bookends the thing. The book should have been called 5 Catholic and Manly Friends Discuss How to Be Gentlemen for 400 pages, featuring Dracula. And at this point in time, he's still pretty much just a hairy-handed, bloodshot-eyed, bad-smelling, wall-crawling, baby-eating, gold-hoarding, coffin-sleeping, real estate-buying monster. We still have a ways to go before we get to this guy. So, after the novel and with the advent of cinema, we start getting some pretty iconic film Draculas. Obviously, we have Murnau's 1922's Nosferatu, which, all in all, is goofy as shit! I love how they use a hyena to represent a werewolf, and that scene in which Orlok is lugging around this coffin like a lunatic to then dematerialize through a door. And as you can see, our boy is very grotesque looking and is generally still monstrous. Then, in 1931, we get the Dracula in Todd Browning's Dracula.
Very original.
Starring the man, the myth, the legend, Bela Lugosi.
I am Dracula.
This guy is the reason for which Halloween vampire costumes look like this. This time, the Romanian rascal is much more charming and suave. He also mentions the fact that eternal life is not that great.
To die, to be really dead, that must be glorious.
Well, Count Dracula.
There are far worse things waiting man than death.
And in general just gets a few cold-ass lines.
For one who has not lived even a single lifetime, you are a wise man, Van Helsing.
But he is still pretty much a mustache-twirling villain. We also need to mention 1958's Horror of Dracula, or just Dracula again.
Very original.
Starring Christopher Lee, who plays a very British-looking Count Dracula. He's only in like a couple of scenes and he plays it cold and spooky. It's more of a Peter Cushing movie, really, who actually makes a pretty cool Van Helsing. I do have to show you these two moments though in which I lost my shit. Here, where he wakes up and silently gets out of the room just to come back a few seconds later making an entrance.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Or here, where Van Helsing finds his coffin in the basement and he just walks in on him like he's in the bathroom with the door unlocked. Pretty goofy overall. We also can't skip Werner Herzog.
Somebody shot at you and created a wound in your abdomen.
It's not significant.
Remake of Nosferatu from 1979, which is just a beautiful movie. Here, Kinski plays a very awkward version of the Count, which is sure to make you feel uncomfortable. This time there's a bit more depth to the character. He talks about eternal life being a curse.
To be unable to grow old is terrible. Death is not the worst. There are things more horrible than death. Can you imagine enduring centuries, experiencing each day the same futile things?
And he wants companionship.
I could change everything. Will you come to me and be my ally? That be salvation for your husband and for me. The absence of love is the most abject pain.
So we're definitely getting close. Then, in 1983, something special happens. Some galaxy-brained individual pitches an idea. Let's make a vampire movie, but wait for it, we'll have David Bowie playing one of the main characters. Tony Scott's The Hunger is a film I never see being talked about, and it's a shame, because it's definitely inspired many of the more modern portrayals of vampires. Miriam Blaylock, played by Catherine Deneuve, is a vampire that has been around at least since the time of ancient Egypt. She now lives in a New York mansion with her companion,
David Bowie.
who she turned some 200 years before. The two dress up and go to clubs together to find victims, and everything is great. But something worrying starts happening. Bowie starts suddenly aging very fast. And we find out that this is what always happens to Miriam's partner sooner or later. And there is no apparent way to stop it. Bowie tries to go to a doctor who is studying sleep and longevity, but she makes him wait so long that he becomes a boomer and goes away and accepts his fate. Now this is where the film gets existentially disturbing. Bowie starts asking Miriam to finish him off, but she comes out with a bombshell. Eternal life is absolute. There is apparently no way to actually die for him. He'll just have to rot forever like all her past partners. She literally puts Bowie, who is now completely decrepit, in a coffin in her attic where she keeps all her rotting but still living past partners and is like, goodbye. Keep him company, guys.
What a psychopath.
She then proceeds to turn the doctor into a vampire so she can be her new partner. But, spoilers, she'd rather die than feed on human blood. So here we see two major themes come out. The tragedy of eternal life, in which you have to see the people you love die around you, in which no matter how you try, you can't put a stop to it. Is it really worth it if it means you will be there actually forever? Seeing the world die and the sun fade out and everything disappear and begin anew and relive it over and over and over and over and over. And the moral question of having to feed on the living. Are you a monster for doing it if you don't really have a choice? Also, let's just mention the fact that the film starts with Bowie and Deneuve dressed like goths in a nightclub where Bauhaus is playing Bela Lugosi's Dead. That's pretty amazing and really on the nose. The classic vampire is dead. Make way for the new generation. In the 80s, we also get the greatest vampire film and the greatest acting performance ever. In 1988, we have Vampire's Kiss, starring the man himself,
Nick fucking Whoa, Cage!
Now listen, this film has been memed to hell and back, but it's genuinely a very fun time. Cage tries to channel the classic expressionist vampires like Nosferatu, and the result is very entertaining. It's also a pretty important film because it shows us what the perception of the vampire has been up to that point. As some of you might know, Cage is not actually a vampire in the film. He just starts believing that he is, and so starts playing into every cliché imaginable. It's kind of like that one Adventure Time episode in which Marceline pretends to turn Finn and Jake into vampires and they start acting like idiots. Often, when a movie gets so meta, it reflects some kind of crisis in its genre. In this case, it signals to us that vampire flicks need some change, some fresh blood, so to speak. And they're about to get it. The 90s is when we really start cooking. We open with the really famous Coppola movie, Bram Stoker's Dracula. You know, the one where Keanu Reeves goes,
I know where the bastard sleeps.
yeah, that one. There are some great things about it, like the artistic direction, especially in the first act set in Transylvania. The idea of this creepy Dracula with a 5-foot red cape who moves very unnaturally and whose shadow doesn't follow him, it's genuinely amazing. Also, it's the first time I've seen a depiction of the scene from the book where the Count crawls down the castle wall, and it really works. Also, Renfield is played by Tom Waits. I don't have to add anything here, right? The most important thing that works well, though, is Dracula himself. Gary Oldman is probably the only one who's genuinely trying here. Maybe trying a bit too hard at times, but it generally pays off. Finally, we get a really sympathetic Dracula who got cursed for denouncing God because of his beloved wife's death, and now sees her reincarnated in Jonathan's wife, Mina. So this time he just comes to England to get his reincarnated wife back, and tries to genuinely win her over instead of forcing her to go with him. When she finally agrees, he starts to turn her, but stops because he realizes how accursed his existence is and doesn't want to ruin her in the same way. With Coppola's film, we've had pretty much a reversal of what was traditionally thought to be a vampire. Old man's Dracula is cursed to live this existence and doesn't relish in it. He even has to contain himself not to hurt the woman he loves, going against his monstrous nature and trying to salvage what is still left of his humanity. The vampire becomes, from this point on, arguably the fascinating and tragic figure we now know and love. So, the 90s keep giving us more and more. Just 2 years later, we have another major film in the genre, Interview with the Vampire by Neil Jordan. Now, I haven't read Rice's novel, but from what I understand, the movie is mostly faithful to the source material. You know how the story goes. Brad Pitt is a plantation owner whose wife and child die. He gets very sad about it and starts looking for death himself. But at his lowest, he is found by vampire Tom Cruise, who was born to play this role and is a joy to watch, who relishes in his vampiric nature and gives him the gift of eternal life and youth by turning him. But as you can imagine, this ends up being more of a curse than a blessing. Now, this film, while not perfect, especially when Cruise is absent from the screen, has it all. We get all the fundamental beats and characteristics that we think of when we think vampires today. The struggle between the vampiric urge to drink human blood and the human urge to abstain from it, to the point of becoming a vegetarian vampire. The loneliness of being a rare and misunderstood creature and the attempt to find others like you. The figure of the eternal vampire as a shadowy observer of the evolution of humanity. The beauty and the attractiveness of such a creature, etc. At this point, the cultural shift is complete. People started seeing vampires as an almost positive figure. It's exactly what Antonio Banderas tells Brad Pitt in the film, because he is the new kind of vampire whose humanity is still alive inside. It's also reflected in the ending of the film, where Slater, who plays the interviewer, after hearing Brad Pitt's very tragic backstory, asks him to turn him into a vampire. This obviously infuriates Pitt, who's all like, "You damn humans are all the same." A good portion of the public would have definitely wanted to become a vampire. I'll also remind you that on November the 4th, just 7 days before the release of this film, a special episode of The X-Files aired. I'm talking about Season 2, Episode 7, titled 3. The first X-Files episode to feature vampires. And what do you know? Our guy falls for the hot vampire lady, who is also all complex and tragic. Just throwing it out there. If it's good for Mulder, it's good for me. Moving on to the 2000s. Wait, were you really about to forget that in 1998 we get the coolest vampire of the century? Now, don't you dare say a bad word about this masterpiece. It's cool, it's full of action, it's goofy, it's just beautiful. Although I always wondered why he looks like a PS1 model on the official poster. As a kid, I probably watched this film a billion times. I remember when I got that horrible Spider-Man Friend or Foe game, which at the time I thought was the shit, and I unlocked Blade and just lost it. I played probably hours and hours only using him. You know how this one goes. Blade is a vampire hunting vampire, or daywalker as they call him in the film, which just sounds like someone who escaped a retirement home.
Hey, I'm daywalking over here.
Whose objective is to destroy all vampires because they're evil killers and he's cool and strong and they kill her too, but only of vampires. Outside of being just the coolest ever, Blade also showed that vampires could be used as characters for action movies too, leaning more into them having superhuman abilities and stuff, which just makes them even cooler, let's be real. Now we get to the really good stuff, because we got Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust. Hell yeah! Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust is an animated movie produced by Madhouse.
Wait a minute!
You know, the same guys that gave us Technolize, Nana, Death Note, Devil May Cry the animated series, One Punch Man, Perfect Blue and Paprika, and that's just a small chunk of it. So yeah, it's bound to be pretty cool.
And it is oh so very, very cool.
Now, to be completely honest with you, I have no idea what the hell is happening half of the time in this movie. Probably because I haven't seen the original one nor read the novels, but it's all just perfect. It's definitely one of the most impressively animated and designed movies I've ever seen.
It just oozes style.
And what do you know? It follows the story of D, a vampire hunter who tries to rescue a defenseless girl from evil Baron Meyer Link. And that's pretty much the whole story, really. but it's set in this beautiful post-apocalyptic future that mixes a bunch of different aesthetics, from steampunk to gothic to sci-fi to western to dark fantasy, etc, etc. In fact, it's so all over the place that I constantly found myself wondering how they pulled it off. It's just
Beautiful.
For this video though, what I'm most interested in is the romance between Baron Meyer and Charlotte. Because you see, she's not actually being taken against her will. The two are truly in love and just want to be left alone. So alone, in fact, that they want to take a space shuttle and leave the Earth together. Baron Meyer himself looks like he came out of a Victorian version of Paradise Kiss and is constantly just trying to protect Charlotte from everyone and especially himself, because he really wants to take a bite out of the bitch, just like Gary Oldman's Dracula. So here we see that new romantic figure of the vampire, which serves the purpose of showing that love can be found even where it seems impossible, and how society all around tries to stop it to maintain the status quo. Even Dee, who is himself a product of that same kind of love and struggles with his mission and identity. Outside of movies and animation, vampires have also a big presence in the video game world. The obvious one is Castlevania, but they're found kind of everywhere. Even Devil May Cry's coolest villain is a vampire. Obviously I'm talking about Nevin, who, when beaten, turns into a sick-ass scythe guitar that shoots electric bats, and we get the best DMC cutscene ever. And yes, I just randomly threw in a minor villain from Devil May Cry 3 because it's the best game ever. Sue me. More recently, think of how everyone lost their marbles over Lady Dimitrescu and her daughters from Resident Evil Village. Gamers obviously love the Bloodsuckers too. But the one that did it best, and I doubt that anyone will argue, is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Now, yes, it is janky. And I mean janky.
Hey, who's there? Someone there? Huh? Someone there? Huh? Hey, who's there? Hey, who's there? Someone there? Hey, who's there? Hey, who's there? Huh? Huh? Someone there? Hey, who's there? Hey, who's there? Someone there? Hey, who's there?
But it's still a treasure trove for any fan of vampires. It has so much passion and detail put into its lore and its atmosphere. It takes everything that has been done so far with vampires and puts it together. All the different types of vampires are here. Nosferatu-style monsters, crazy and magic voodoo people, hot and charming Tom Cruises, hippies in touch with nature, etc, etc. All the different tropes are used in one way or the other, and we find many different types of aesthetics all in the same world. Most importantly, it places you in the shoes of a vampire, because you are illegally turned at the start of the game and become the errand boy for the self-proclaimed vampire prince. You start finding out about the way this secret vampire society functions, the different factions and their conflicts, like the smelly anarchs, the stick-up-their-ass bourgeois camarilla, the brain-dead and violent Sabbat. There's also the whole thing about thin bloods who are neither vampire nor mortal, so they become social outcasts on which everyone looks down. It poses all the usual questions about morality, addiction, loneliness, and blood contamination, which is a theme that I rarely see in vampire media, although it makes total sense that there are risks in drinking certain types of blood, and that vampires would be opening themselves up for health problems. You meet all kind of characters, and for every insane asshole, there is a friendly or sweet and caring vampire. You meet a lot of great and memorable characters along the way, like Velvet Velour, who's got the best voice ever.
This is gonna be interesting. I'm Velvet Velour. Call me Velvet.
Bertrand Tongue, Beckett, Jeanette, Strauss, etc. It's such a great experience with so many interesting ideas, and it's a shame that the new one is not looking that good. In general, there are tons of different themes to explore in Bloodlines, so give it a try if you're okay with a truckload of jank. By At this point, we start seeing positive representations of vampires everywhere, and they often end up becoming beloved characters. Just think of the already mentioned Marceline from Adventure Time, for example, the 1,000-year-old vampire queen who's been through some stuff, and now just wants to chill out by flying around, hanging around her friends, and playing her bass. And as many of you surely know, Adventure Time delves into some mature themes and knows when to get serious. Marceline is probably one of the best examples. In the 1,000 years she's been around, she learned not to get too attached to people, because she'll usually outlive them. So when she finally befriends these goofballs, she has to learn how to be among people again. And she needs to come to terms with her past and with the way she tries to push everyone away by pretending to be evil and stuff. She constantly grows up during the run of the series, maturing a little bit each season and learning to care for others and allowing them to care about her. She also has to accept her nature as a vampire and learn how to appreciate it instead of trying to turn back. Also, let's not even talk about how Marshall Lee became the fan favorite after one appearance.
It's crazy.
You should see at this point how often vampires end up reflecting their time and the social issues that plague it. The cool thing though is that they also carry with them all their history. The vampire genre has become kind of a melting pot in which filmmakers and other artists can throw almost anything, really. A good example of this is Park Chan-wook's Thirst from 2009, which stars Song Kang-ho as a Catholic priest who gets infected with vampire blood after volunteering to help find a vaccine for a deadly disease. Now, the metaphor is very obvious. He's a morally upstanding man of faith who devotes his life to helping others and suddenly finds himself battling against his newfound nature. He realizes that he needs human blood to survive, so he starts drinking from a coma patient who was known for sharing his food with others. Yeah, the metaphors in this movie are extremely on the nose, and the director really leans into it. It is a dramatic movie, but just like all of Park Chan-wook's films, it has a good dose of humor. If you've seen Old Boy or any Bong Joon-ho movies like Parasite, you know what I'm talking about. Our protagonist, Sang-hyun, is seen as a miracle worker after his incredible recovery. And at first, he too thinks that he's been blessed, but when his vampiric instincts start to show, he begins questioning his beliefs. This is also not helped by the fact that his mentor starts helping him in hope of getting some of that good vampire blood to cure his blindness, and by his growing closeness to Taeju, a woman who lives with her bumbling idiot fiancé who is constantly sick, and his alcoholic mother. He starts lusting after her, letting himself gradually go to his desires, until he starts realizing that she's kind of fucked up. I don't want to spoil everything for you, because this is a great movie that you should absolutely watch. But as you see, we get our big themes again. The moral question of drinking people's blood, the liberation of one's natural and carnal instincts, the search for a companion, the desire of other people to sell their soul, so to say, to become vampires, etc., etc. And again, our protagonist is a vampire himself, so we see everything through his point of view. We are made to walk in his shoes. If we move forward by a couple of years, we get what is, in my opinion, the best movie about vampires. I'm talking about 2013's Only Lovers Left Alive, by the coolest director in the game, Jim Jarmusch. The film stars Tilda Swinton, who is my favorite vampire ever, and Tom Hiddleston as Eve and Adam, a vampire couple that has two pretty distinct approaches to eternal life. You see, Eve has been living for 2,000 years, so she's got her stuff figured out, but Adam, well, he's going through something. He's been a vampire for about 500 years and is going through his existentially depressed teen phase. He looks at the world around him, at how the zombies, aka us normal humans, are destroying everything and each other. He's self-obsessed and absorbed in suicidal thoughts, so Eve is like,
oh, fuck. All right, I'll come.
And tries to cheer him up. The two are like yin and yang. Eve is an observer. She consumes literature and forms connections with people, and most importantly, dances. While Adam is a musician, a builder, and always has to create or fix something. It's also pretty obviously symbolized by their appearance, Eve being always clad in white and Adam in black, and their amulets having inverted colors. We've got all the usual suspects here: the weight of eternal life and seeing the sad involution of the human race, the morality of drinking blood, which the protagonists try to get from hospitals because
this is the bloody 21st century.
The need for companionship, the risk of drinking contaminated blood, the theme of addiction, which is pretty evident in the way they consume blood as if it were a potent drug that they need daily to function. So, this time, it's not just that our two protagonists are vampires or the fact that they're cool and likable. It's the fact that they directly mirror us. They are two representations of how one can live their life. While their existence gets stretched through the ages and they have an incredible amount of wisdom when compared to us, they still end up having the usual problems that normal people have. And they do just feel like humans for the viewer. They just sleep during the day. Out of all things vampire, this is the one that made me think the most. You see, I'm one of those people that would actually love eternal life. You know, because there are so many things to experience and so little time. But who knows what it would actually be like? Would you want eternal life, or do you think that its fleeting nature is exactly what gives it meaning? Another vampire flick that came out just a year later is A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, an Iranian film obviously inspired by Jarmusch. This one is mostly style over substance, having one main metaphor on which everything is built, which is something like everybody sucks someone, or like we suck the life out of everything. I don't know, but it's very on the nose about it. In this case, our vampire is just like every other character, morally corrupt, but possibly because of the world in which she grew up, which is unforgiving and dreary. I mean, the place is literally called Bad City. There's also again the theme of companionship, which seems to be, at this point in our culture, absolutely a must for vampire stories. I wonder why. It's a very cool watch if you like stylish and slow black and white movies. Oh, and we also get Skateboard Vampire. And how didn't we realize before that a black chador is a perfect vampire outfit? So, I think we can stop here for now, or this video will go on forever. We've seen vampires go from scary and evil monsters to hot and gloomy models in the span of roughly 100 years. We've also looked at enough different examples to say that the characteristics of vampires are never stable, but are taken out and put in at will by directors, artists, game devs, etc., etc. The only vampiric trait that seems always present, which we could call the most fundamental one to identify a vampire, is blood drinking. Everything else can vary. Their success is surely due in part to their intrinsic sinful nature, in which we as viewers can see some form of liberation and freedom, if not power. Vampires are in many ways superior to us, but that alone can't elevate them to the level of fame at which they currently reside. It is thanks to their weaknesses that we can connect with them. And I'm not talking about being burned by the sun or garlic or any of that. I mean their hunger or thirst, their need to sleep, and the way they are usually exposed to danger when they do so. Hey, look, they're just like me. But most important of all, their loneliness, their otherness, uniqueness, or rarity, if you will. It is exactly the contradictions between power and frailty and humanity or inhumanity that makes these creatures so fascinating. I don't know, I might be just saying obvious stuff here. You tell me what you think. Thank you all for watching, and thank you so much for all the support you showed my last video. And see you, space vampires. The video is over. You can go now. Shoo. There is nothing here.